Hello, welcome to our fourth and final installment of Emotional Health and Spiritual Maturity. Today I would like to talk about living in emotional systems with what we call emotional triangles, and how emotional health provides us the tools to remove ourselves from these emotional triangles. Going back to our previous class, recall that an emotional system refers to the set of interdependent relationships among members of a bound group. Key to the life of an emotional system is the level of chronic anxiety or tension to which the system is subject, and the level of emotional maturity of the system of the members of the system. To understand the relationship between anxiety and emotional health, the image of a water reservoir may be helpful. We can think of chronic anxiety as the water level and emotional maturity as the size of the reservoir. In other words, the greater degree of emotional maturity within the system, the more anxiety that system can contain without spilling over and producing a problem for the system. Last time we spoke about the problem of chronic anxiety within family and church systems, but today I want us to consider some of the common types of chronic anxiety. While there may be others, I want us to focus on four common types: conflict, hurting or distance, overfunctioning and underfunctioning, and finally projection. The most obvious form of chronic anxiety is what we call conflict. This is where the members of the system are intensely reactive to one another. Conflict is characterized by intense emotions and ongoing argument. Most often the members relate to one another in a sort of all or nothing manner that prohibits harmony. Rather than addressing chronic or long-term behavioral patterns themselves, too often the focus of the family will be on immediate or acute issues. Conversations within the group will often be characterized by accusation and judgment. And while this type may be the most obvious, it isn't necessarily the most common. Let's move on to the next type. Hurting or distance occurs within families or churches when the members focus on their togetherness, but genuine emotional engagement is minimized. So one can think of the family who gathers together around the dinner table or in the family room, but each member is withdrawn from one another and are not really engaged with each other. The emergence of smartphones, tablets, and laptops have made this coping strategy very common in our society today. Hurting or distance is characterized by relationships that are rather superficial, and conflict or dissension within the group is often quickly smothered by a sort of let's just all get along mentality. Another common type of chronic anxiety is the system that contains both overfunctioners and underfunctioners. If there is a member of any system that always seems to go above and beyond what they are responsible for themselves, this person is overfunctioning. This also means that somewhere in the system there is an underfunctioner as well. By functioning, we simply mean living within the system and performing the responsibilities that a person has as an individual. Overfunctioning simply means that one person is doing more than what they are responsible for, while someone else is not pulling their weight. This relationship is characterized by imbalance. You will see this in a congregation when people complain that only 20% of the people do nearly 80% of all the work that needs to be done. This complaining itself is a form of emotional immaturity. The challenge is often faced by the overfunctioner. The challenge faced by the overfunctioner is the temptation to simply stop doing what they're doing in order to force the non-functioner to start doing what they're doing. But this too is another form of overfunctioning. The last type of anxiety that we'll look at is that of projection. This is where the members of the system unite together in order to accuse or blame another member of the system or someone outside of the system for their problems. Sometimes this doesn't have to be a person. One can imagine a parent who is overcautious and hypersensitive about safety for their children. But such behavior may result in the child failing to learn important skills in fending for themselves or being willing to engage in adventurous activities. Projection can be powerful because it can provide the group with a sense of togetherness and progress and growth. Think of how members of a church may feel strongly united together, but it's only because they find commonality in talking about other people's wrong theology or pet political views. They may feel close, but they're more likely avoiding real relational problems. Now, so far we've been talking about emotional systems as a whole, but it is important to take some time to look at what we might call the building blocks or molecules of emotional systems. These are what we call emotional triangles. An emotional triangle describes the way any two people may draw in a third member in order to cope with the anxiety produced in their relationship. Along with the presence of a third person, sometimes an emotional triangle will consist of only two people, but there will be the presence of a third issue that takes the place of a third person. As we mentioned last time, any two-person relationship is typically unstable and prone to produce anxiety. When this happens, it is often the case that a third person will be brought in. So for example, we may ask a third person for their advice or validation in a matter having to do with someone else, thus creating an ally for our own opinion or our own point of view. So for example, if Jill and Alex are having a disagreement about where a certain picture should be hung in the church's foyer, Jill may talk with Susan to try to get Susan to agree with her point of view and help her to show why Alex is wrong. The problem with this is that what Jill is actually seeking is to relieve her anxiety produced by the dispute by placing that anxiety upon Susan. Now Susan is unfairly burdened by an anxiety that she did not ask to bear. Jill may feel better in talking with Susan, but this triangle only compounds the anxiety present in the emotional system. Gossip is another common form of an emotional triangle. Sometimes it can take a less obvious form, such as when a parent becomes over-involved with their children while avoiding a marital issue. Emotional triangles are like the engines that produce so much of the emotional system's chronic anxiety. So how do we take ourselves out of emotional triangles while remaining thoughtfully and emotionally connected with others in the system? Some of the things we want to consider here are: 1, learning to define oneself, 2, giving up over-functioning, 3, setting clear boundaries, and 4, developing a pause button. These 4 actions are very much related to what we have been calling emotional maturity. Learning to define oneself is sometimes called self-differentiation. Learning to define oneself entails having the courage to live out of a clear sense of who you are in the midst of others. In other words, it is essentially living out emotional maturity within your system. And I mention courage because doing this is actually one of the most difficult things we can face in our day-to-day relationships with others. Defining oneself also means refusing to sacrifice one's sense of self in an effort to preserve harmony with others. Strategies of appeasement with others is a way of coping and avoiding the anxiety in the relationship. And at the same time, defining oneself does not mean demanding the compliance of others in order to feel secure as well. Giving up over-functioning means having the courage to make yourself and your responsibilities your primary focus. Now, this shouldn't be understood as a form of selfishness. Selfishness is the focus on the self at the expense of being connected to others. Over-functioning occurs when we become too focused on the responsibilities of others and are then lured into trying to compensate for the failure of others. We must recognize that the temptation to focus on and compensate for the needs, feelings, choices, and responsibilities of others is an anxiety-driven temptation. Giving up over-functioning makes space for the under-functioning person to grow in their ability to do their responsibility. Next, there is the importance of setting clear boundaries. Boundaries say what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. It both entails the keeping of what is proper to us and respecting of what is proper to others. Boundaries help us understand which feelings, decisions, thoughts, and principles belong to us and which belong to others. Godly maturity requires us to clearly communicate our boundaries and respect the boundaries of others. In order to set clear boundaries, we need to clearly communicate what our boundaries are. We also need a healthy visualization of how our boundaries function. One can envision a boundary as though is a chalk line where people easily step over it. And at the same time, one could envision their boundaries as though they're bound and sealed like Fort Knox. Thinking about how our boundaries work will provide us a clear sense of what is and is not a transgression of that boundary. Finally, we need to recognize that the various ways in which we may often trespass the boundaries of others. When it comes to trespassing the boundaries of others, it might help us to ask questions of ourselves like, do we do for others what they can and should do for themselves? Do we demand that others conform to our way of thinking? Do we constantly try to argue others out of their opinions and feelings? Do we try to control the behavior or responses of others, even when it's for their own good? Finally, it's crucial when relating to others that we develop what we might call a pause button. As we've looked at emotional health, we've seen how our own brains are designed to provide us with the capacity for thoughtful reflection and evaluation of our own emotions. Bringing this capacity into our lives with others by learning to pause and think rather than merely react is crucial for breaking emotional triangles and improving the function of the emotional system as a whole. Learn to hold up your hands and say, wait a minute, I need to slow down and think, or this is going too fast. These are helpful, non-reactive ways of pausing to give thoughtful reflection in the midst of intense and anxious situations. Well, we've come to the end of our time and to the end of this class. As you may be telling yourself right now, there is so much more for us to consider and talk about when it comes to emotional health and spiritual maturity. If there's one goal that I hope we can take from this class, it's that we might learn to value becoming a non-anxious presence within our emotional systems. Even the presence of one person within the system can affect healthy change for the whole. This makes it our goal, or let's make it our goal, to increase our self-awareness, monitor our thoughts, manage our emotions, and slow the pace in how we emotionally live with one another. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to our discussion time next Sunday.